The year was 1937, and Nevada State Route 34, now renamed State Route 447, was little more than a desolate, winding road cutting through the barren expanse between the towns of Wadsworth and Gerlach. Back then, the desert was still wild and untouched, its vast stretches of sand and sagebrush interrupted only by jagged mountains and strange rock formations. The road was isolated, with few travelers daring to brave its lonely stretch after dark. But those who did had stories to tell, stories of strange creatures, eerie lights in the sky, and disappearances that no one could explain. One such story belonged to Frank Lewis, a rancher from Wadsworth who was known for his no-nonsense attitude and steady hand. He didn't believe in ghosts or tall tales, and he scoffed at the rumors that had been circulating about State Route 34. Still, when his cousin Charlie didn't return from a cattle run to Gerlach, Frank was forced to confront the strange reality that something might indeed be wrong with the road. It was a cool October evening when Frank set out to search for his cousin. He was driving his old Ford Model A, a sturdy car that he had trusted for years. The engine purred steadily as he rolled down the nearly empty road, the headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. The sun had already set behind the distant mountains, leaving the desert in a state of twilight that made the landscape feel even more surreal. The sagebrush appeared as ghostly silhouettes against the dusky horizon, and the wind howled mournfully through the empty stretches of land. Frank kept his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing up at the sky. He had heard the stories of bright, glowing lights that hovered in the sky like strange, silent sentinels. Some said they were stars, others claimed they were alien craft or something even more sinister. Frank didn't buy any of it. Still, there was an uneasy feeling in his gut as he passed a familiar stretch of road where, according to local gossip, more than a few travelers had vanished without a trace. As the miles dragged on, Frank noticed something odd. The air had grown unnaturally still, and the temperature had dropped dramatically. The desert, usually filled with the sounds of coyotes and the rustle of small creatures in the brush, was now silent. The only noise was the steady hum of his engine and the crunch of gravel beneath his tires. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something in the distance, an animal, but not one he recognized. It was large, bigger than any coyote or wild dog he had ever seen, with fur that shimmered in the fading light. Its eyes reflected the headlights in an unnatural way, glowing a sickly yellow. It stood in the middle of the road, unmoving, as if daring him to approach. Frank slowed the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart began to race as he drew closer. The animal, if that's what it was, had a strange, elongated body, like something twisted out of shape. Its legs were too long, its back hunched, and its head too large for its frame. It almost looked like a wolf, but something was very wrong with it. As he neared, the creature let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills down Frank's spine. Without warning, the thing bolted into the desert, disappearing into the sagebrush. Frank exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. Shaking his head, he tried to convince himself that it was just a strange coyote, nothing more. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. As Frank continued driving, the air grew even colder, and an oppressive feeling seemed to settle over the road. The sky, once clear, was now filled with swirling clouds, blocking out the moonlight. That's when he saw it, the lights. At first, they were faint, like distant stars on the horizon. But as he continued, they grew brighter and larger, floating above the desert like ghostly orbs. There were 3 of them, moving slowly and deliberately, as if they were searching for something. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he watched them in his rearview mirror, his heart pounding. The lights followed him, keeping pace with his car but staying just out of reach. The road ahead curved slightly, and as Frank rounded the bend, he saw another car, an old Dodge, sitting abandoned by the side of the road. Its hood was up, and steam rose from the engine, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. Frank slowed to a stop, rolling down his window and calling out. There was no answer. He glanced around, hoping to see a figure walking in the distance, but the only movement was the flickering of the strange lights in the sky. Unease settled deep in his bones. The lights, now closer than before, hovered above the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the desert. They flickered unnaturally, like they were watching, waiting for something. Frank debated whether to investigate the abandoned car or keep going. His gut told him to leave, but something about the Dodge tugged at his curiosity. He stepped out of his Ford and cautiously approached the car. The air was cold and unnervingly silent. As Frank reached the Dodge, he saw that the driver's side door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. He glanced inside, half expecting to find a body, but there was nothing, no sign of struggle, no blood. It was as if the driver had simply vanished. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from behind him, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. Frank whipped around, his heart in his throat. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure, tall, dark, and featureless, like a shadow brought to life. It was watching him, unmoving, its presence chilling. Frank backed away slowly, his breath quickening. The lights above seemed to pulse in response to the figure's appearance, casting an unnatural glow over the scene. He didn't dare take his eyes off the shadowy figure as he made his way back to his car. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, silent, as if it were waiting for something. Frank fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, and quickly climbed back into the Ford. As soon as he slammed the door, the figure vanished, melting into the night like it had never been there. Frank didn't waste another second. He threw the car into gear and sped down the road, the tires kicking up dust as he barreled forward. The lights in the sky followed him, now closer than ever, almost as if they were chasing him. His heart raced, and his palms were slick with sweat despite the freezing air inside the car. Suddenly, out of nowhere, something darted in front of the car, another one of those strange creatures. This time, it was larger, with glowing red eyes and a body that seemed to ripple in the moonlight. Frank swerved, narrowly avoiding it, but the car veered off the road and into the ditch. The front end hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, and the engine sputtered before going silent. For a moment, Frank sat there, stunned, the lights still swirling above him. His head spun, and his chest tightened with fear. The desert around him was completely still, save for the low hum of the lights in the sky. He felt trapped, alone in the vast emptiness, with no way to call for help. Just as Frank began to gather his thoughts, he saw movement in the rearview mirror. A figure was walking toward the car, slowly, deliberately. It was the same shadowy figure from earlier, now closer than before. But this time, it wasn't alone. Two more figures followed behind it, their forms shifting and flickering like they were made of smoke and shadow. Frank's pulse pounded in his ears as the figures approached, their dark, faceless forms looming closer. The air around them seemed to vibrate, and the lights in the sky pulsed in time with their movements. Frank fumbled for the ignition, trying to start the car, but the engine refused to turn over. The figures were nearly upon him now, their presence overwhelming. His breath came in ragged gasps as he desperately cranked the key again. Finally, with a loud sputter, the engine roared to life. Without looking back, Frank slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning as the Ford lurched out of the ditch. The figures stood in the rearview mirror, watching him as he sped away, their dark forms dissolving into the night. As Frank hurtled down State Route 34, the lights in the sky faded, and the oppressive chill lifted. But the memory of what he had seen lingered, burned into his mind. He didn't stop driving until he reached Wadsworth, where he collapsed in a fit of nervous exhaustion. He never spoke of that night again, but from then on, Frank avoided State Route 34 after dark. He wasn't the only one. Stories of strange lights and figures continued to circulate among travelers, and the number of accidents and disappearances along the road only grew. State Route 34, it seemed, held its secrets close. And those who dared to travel it after dark would never forget the haunting lights of the Nevada desert.